Welcome back everyone to the React In-Depth series. In this video, what I'd like to do is go over a topic called component composition. Now that sounds quite fancy, and indeed, I guess it kind of is. I was actually quite, struggling to figure out how to actually make this video. I actually really kind of have two topics that I really want to cover. However, both of these topics are kind of technically separate from each other, but one really needs the other one. So I decided to split it up because these topics are so important to learn in isolation, and they come up so often, not only in React, but also in other programming languages as well as frameworks, that it's really important to understand that they are really two separate topics. So I'll make a short video for this one, and then we'll kind of do the second quote unquote half of this in the next video, where we're going to talk about props, which is kind of the brother or the sister to the idea of component composition, especially in something like React. So without further ado, let's just get right to the content so I can see what I'm even talking about. Okay, so to start, I just want to kind of define what this means, since this term might be new for a lot of us. So component composition, to compose means to kind of put things together, right? Like if you think of like composing music, you're putting a bunch of notes together or words together, and you're composing something brand new from scratch, so or from different components. In the context of React, what we're going to be doing is composing not notes for music, but components together, right? So for example, if we have like a nav bar or a header and a footer, you can think of like a page as a composition of these different components and ideas, where we can actually build an entire app together using these different concepts. And naturally, when we have this idea of a composition with components, we end up with this kind of a parent and child relationship between the components. And this is going to become even more apparent when we actually get to the next topic, which is related to this, which is called props. But for now, this will also kind of give us a good heads up. Now, this idea of composition isn't unique to React. It's really important to know that this idea of component composition comes from really functional composition in the idea of just computer science or programming. It's actually a really beautiful topic. Part of me actually wanted to put some like fancy math on these slides to kind of explain some of the concepts, but I tried to avert that a little bit just because I know that can scare a lot of people. But functional composition is quite a beautiful concept. And there's a lot of math that backs up this idea of how that actually works in theory. That's actually quite magnificent to learn. So if you're interested, definitely take a Google for that and see kind of what you can come up with, and you'll see how it relates to this topic. But it is a whole entire topic, and I'll probably get into that in actually a future series on this channel together. But it is basically rooted in this theory of functional composition, which modern React is really based on top of. Okay, so next, I want to kind of talk about this idea of our element trees. So right in front of me here, I have kind of like a HTML elements tree, right? We have the body, and then in this body, we kind of have different children. So we have two direct children here, the nav element and the div element, and then each of those respectively have their own children, and then their children's children, etc., etc. So this nav has like 3 levels deep, and so does this div. And they're not really related to each other, apart from the fact that they're quote unquote siblings in this element tree. Okay, now this is a really important concept to keep in the back of your mind, because this idea of thinking of your app and your component structure as these tree structures becomes really important and helps you understand and debug a lot of potential issues that might come up as we progress through React together. Now, if we took that exact example that we just looked at together and we kind of wrapped it up in the React land, what we would end up is these kind of components right here, right? So on the left here, I kind of wrapped up this nav set of elements into a component, which we saw in previous videos. And I'm going to call that nav bar, and that would just return the JSX, for example, for this nav element with this UL and 3 LIs inside of it. Okay, maybe it would have some other things in there, but it's really going to return this JSX, and I can wrap it all on a nice nav bar component. And same thing here on the right side, I have the contact form, and it has its respective elements as well. So it would return this div and the JSX with the H1, the form, and the different inputs and buttons inside of it. Okay, so this is kind of how we would think of our app in the context of a React tree, right? So just to switch back and forth between these real quick, like this is just regular old HTML, and then this is React, where we can actually kind of group these together and give them names, and we call those components. Okay, now what we've been doing kind of subtly so far, and I haven't really explained it until now, which is where we're kind of getting to really explaining how it works behind the scenes, is we've actually, especially in the exercises and some of the previous videos, put these different components that we created, for example, the navbar or the contact form or any other components, we actually kind of, if you remember, slotted it into the app.jsx file, right? So we kind of had like the strict mode thing, and we kind of put our navbar inside of there, our contact form inside of there, and we just render on the screen. Now, if you think about it, this picture right here is technically what's happening behind the scenes in our applications thus far. We have our kind of app component in React, which is usually in that kind of like main.jsx file, at least in something like Vite, but in other like bundlers and things, it might be a different named file by default, but you can name it really whatever you want. And we've kind of slotted in these different components inside of there, inside of the app component. So what we've actually been doing is putting components inside of our other components. Now, those components were very simple and were kind of pre-built for us in the context of the app component, at least so far. But really, what this is this idea of composition, right? You can see that here we have like a top level app component, and then inside of there, we have our navbar and then our contact form. And those are both inside of the app component, and each the navbar and the contact form themselves have their own things inside of them. Now, you can probably extrapolate this and imagine you can actually have components have different components in them, which have different components of them, which have eventually the base HTML elements inside of those, right? So at the end of the day, everything does need to render down to actual HTML elements, but we can compose these different elements together, so it's easier for us as developers and designers to actually create our app in such a way that makes sense, very similar to this, where we want to group things for the navbar together, or the footer, or the header, or the shopping cart, and things like that, all in one spot. And those would be made up of subcomponents. And this idea of grouping these things together, especially those things inside the group are also components themselves, is this idea of component composition. So I just kind of really want to show you what this looks like in the actual code. So let's take a look at this contact form that I had on the right side of the previous diagram. Now, the code for this component would look kind of like this. I think I forgot my return here, but you can imagine that this is returning this JSX right here, right? And we have the div, which has the two children, the H1 and then the form, and then the form has three children inside of it, the two inputs and then the button. And we return this all as JSX, and this entire kind of blob of JSX would be from this contact form component. And we can kind of call the function directly, which would execute this code and return as their JSX. But then the nice kind of way to write this in React, which we've been using so far, is this kind of JSX way of writing it, which is kind of like syntactic sugar, or a nicer, more HTML-friendly lookalike, which is actually just doing this behind the scene, where we can actually just treat it kind of like we would treat any other tag. So it looks a little bit cleaner inside the actual HTML, or the JSX, I should say. Okay, so this is a contact form right here, just to recap this, and it has base HTML elements inside of it, and this would be the component on the right-hand side in the actual code with just a return over there, returning all this JSX, and then we can create that as an actual component, just like so down here. Now, here is where it all comes together. If we had kind of this diagram right here, where we have an app, and we have our navbar and then our contact form, and these are part of the app component, what we'd actually end up with is this. And this is what I was talking about before, where I said in our app main.jsx file, we actually had, it looks slightly different than this because I believe we had like a strict mode inside there, and I'll show you this in the code in a second where we'll actually do an example together. But really what's happening is we can actually take these two components, the navbar and the contact form. We saw the contact form right here. You can imagine the navbar would be something similar. And we can actually put them together as actual elements beside each other in another component, right? So this app is itself a component that is actually returning two components inside of it. So what React is going to do is going to go into those functions, execute them, get the JSX, and kind of replace each of these sections with the respective actual markup that comes back from that. But it's much easier to read this than it is to actually try to put everything in one place. Imagine if how big this app.jsx or main.jsx file would get if we just had to put all our code into one place. It's much easier to split up our app into different components like this. And in those components, we can work on the actual, in isolation, those concepts and the styling and all the logic that comes with it, which we'll see in future videos. And then we can actually compose those and mix and match them just like Lego blocks to actually build up an app. And we can even use the same components in different parts of the application, which is pretty awesome. Okay, now to just wrap up this video, what I'd like to do is actually put this in our VS Code so we can actually take a look at this working together. So I'm going to switch over here to VS Code. I'm just going to run here in my terminal, npm create vite at latest, and that's going to go ahead and create our Vite app. I'm just going to call this composition. I'm going to make sure I use React here. I'm just going to use regular JavaScript, and it's going to tell me to switch to that folder. And then I'm going to run npm install in there. So while that is installing, I'm going to open up my composition folder, my source folder. I'm going to open up my main.jsx and my app.jsx while that's installing. And inside of these, what we can see is this is the main.jsx file, right? So we can see that in here, we're actually rendering React strict mode, whatever that means. And then we have our app inside of there. And the app is coming from app.jsx, which is over here. And if I open that one up, we can see that this is its own component. I'm going to get rid of this stuff in here. And I'm just going to actually return in here. I'm going to get rid of everything in there. And I'm going to return a h1 tag. I'm just going to say hello. Okay, I'm just going to get rid of some of these imports here because we're not actually using them, as well as the actual CSS file, just to keep it super simple. And this is our app file right there. Now I'm going to run npm run dev here, and that's going to start the actual dev server now that our node modules is installed. And if I command click or control click on this local host link here, or you can just copy and paste it, that should open up in my browser, and we should actually see our hello listed there. I'm going to open up the inspector just so we can take a quick look at that if need be. And there is our actual markup, right? So here is our div ID of root, and inside there is our h1 because that's the only thing we told it to render. Now, just to kind of copy what we had in the slides there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new component here in the source folder, and I'll call this ContactForm.jsx. And if we come back to our app here, we saw that it has a div with an h1 and a form. So let's do that. So I'm going to call a function ContactForm. And in here, I'm going to return some JSX. And since this is going to be multiple lines, I'm just going to wrap this all in regular brackets, just so that it doesn't actually return the wrong thing. Because if I put this on just one line, it might break. And I'm going to return a div to wrap this all. And inside of the div, I have an h1. And then outside the h1, I have a form. And then inside the form, I'll just ignore the action for now. Inside the form, I have 2 input elements, and I have a button element. And I'll just put submit in there just for example. And I'll just say hello. Here, I'll just put contact. Okay, so that's our contact form. I'm going to export default contact form. You can also export it not as a default. Generally, if it's the only thing in there, a lot of people like to use default. And you could, the alternative to this would be to export contact form if you want to do a named export. So it really depends on kind of which flavor you like more. Let's go ahead and build the second one really quick. Just a navbar.jsx. It's good practice to build these things out so that you can feel comfortable making these components in here. I'm going to call this function navbar. I always spelled that wrong. And in there, I have my nav element, which I should make sure I return and put that like that. And you might see this, you might get confused with why we need brackets. I encourage you to see what happens if you don't put brackets. Sometimes what will end up happening is you end up getting something like this, return, and then the semicolon will go here, and this will actually return undefined from the function, and it'll actually ignore your JSX if you don't have brackets around it. So just be aware of that. That's why people generally tend to put these brackets so that we know that we're returning all this stuff together. And in there we have our UL, and then we have our LI, and we have 3 of those. and I'll just put like 1, 2, 3 in there just to make it nice and quick. And I'll say export default, and this is going to be our navbar. And again, you can export it as a named export if you like, but I'll just go with that. Okay, great. So now we have our navbar, we have our contact form. In our app.jsx, what I'm going to do is I'm going to import contact form from contact form, and I'm also going to import navbar from our navbar, right? So this is in the current folder, navbar, and what you really want to do is to do the extensions here. So I want to add my autocomplete here, didn't add the extensions, make sure to add the extensions there, and that should get that working. Cool. So now what we can do is I can technically put this hello in there, and I'll just put you know, this is the app, for example. Technically I should probably put some HTML markers around that, but that's fine. But what I can do now is I can actually put the navbar over here, and I can also put the contact form over here, right? So let me save this. I'll just switch back to my Chrome, and you can see that this actually shows up. So this right here, right, is coming from app.jsx. That's this part right here. Now the navbar, which is this 1, 2, 3, this nav, this UL right here, which I've highlighted here, right? That is coming from navbar. And where is that actually coming from? This is coming from this file right here, right? That's coming from here. So you can think of it as copying and pasting basically this, right, over here. That's really what's happening behind the scenes. Okay, it's just much easier to read this and have less code in one place than it is to have all that kind of jumbled up together. And this is just generally kind of what we do in programming in general, right? We make functions for things, we split up files into different modules and put them in different files all over the place, and we have nice folder structures to organize things. And this is just another way to kind of do that. This is just a React way to do it using JSX. And the same thing for contact form. Contact form is this area right here on the very bottom, right? So you can see that that's all in this div right here, and it has the H1 in the form, and the form has its 3 elements inside of there. And that's coming from contact form, which again is calling this function here and returning this JSX right over here. Okay, so really important to keep that in mind, that this single app component is actually rendering this thing right here is rendering itself plus 2 other components that are composed within it, right? So it's rendering kind of its own stuff here, plus it's composed with 2 other elements inside of it. And you can imagine that this could go on and on and on and on. And in very large React applications, that's exactly what happens. This is where we get a tree of components, right? You could imagine that navbar itself is actually not made up of just simply a UL and a bunch of LIs and nav. It's actually made up of its own subcomponents, which further break things down further and further and further. And eventually we land up with just regular HTML, just like we see over here. And the contact form might be the same, for example, right? So the nice thing is that we can reuse these all over the place. We can trace things very easily, and React has a really nice way to actually kind of figure out optimal ways to actually make this as quick as possible for us if we split out things nicely and are smart with how we actually do that. So this really is the idea of component composition. And if you have the developer tools installed for React, which we did in the introduction video, you can switch over to that. You can see over here I have components. I'm just going to switch over to that. And we can see that we have the app component in here, and it's taking a little while to load. Oh, it timed out. I'm not really sure why that was so slow. Let me try to reload this really quick. There we go. We have the app component right here. And inside of app, we have navbar and contact form, right? This is a really nice way to actually see things at the component level. Because if we compare this to our elements tab, which shows us everything in the regular markup for HTML that actually gets rendered to the DOM, and once it's created to DOM elements, it's quite different from being able to look at things over here, where we can see things at the component level. This is going to become more and more useful as we add more and more components, and we have huge trees of components, and when we look into things like state and other hooks like that in future videos as well. So at the end of the day, I think the most important takeaway from all of this is that this idea of component composition allows us to compose different React elements together to actually split up functionality and isolate things from each other, and then put them together just like you would building blocks or Lego blocks, something like that, to actually build up our application step by step. On very large teams, what ends up happening is you'll be assigned either by yourself or with a group of people to work on these kind of subcomponents. And eventually, these subcomponents across many different people on a team might end up being built up into a very large application where a group over here might be working on some components, another group over here might be working on some components, and same over here. And at the very end, you kind of put them together and make sure they all work together. All right. So this idea is totally separate idea from the next idea, what we're going to be looking at, which is props, but it is directly related to it. So I actually was struggling to figure out which to come first, which to come second, or whether to put them in one video. But also for sake of time and just understanding and to really show the importance of this particular topic in and of itself, I wanted to put it in its own video. Now, the power of this is going to become more apparent when we mix it with this idea in the next video, which is going to be the idea of props. And we're actually going to even look at something called prop drilling a little bit. And we're going to be able to combine this idea of component composition with props to actually make components that have different values, and we can actually reuse things like this much nicer. Because if you think about it right now, this is all hard-coded text right here. Imagine it would be really nice to be able to say, okay, I want this contact form or this form to have this data inside of it, and maybe this type of input or that type of input, and just change things slightly, or this title and change this header without actually having to create a totally new component. But it's directly related to this idea of component composition. And in order to understand how props work, it's important to understand component composition. And in order to really take advantage of component composition, we also need to look at how props work and how this tree structure is made. So at the end of the day, I think to wrap this all up, really keep this idea in mind, and a diagram like this of a tree structure at the back of your mind as you're developing your React applications. Because really, if you can think of your app in this structure, and if you look into a new project, for example, and you kind of break it down into this structure, it's much easier to reason with where you have to look to fix things, where you have to look to add things, and how to even build up your own application from scratch. So that said, what we're going to do is a little bit different in this video. We're not going to go exercises right away. I'm actually going to create a video with the props and the props drilling, and we're going to do exercises kind of combined for this idea of component composition and props together. So I'll see you in the next video where we'll look at props and the idea of prop drilling together, and we're going to combine it with component composition. No pun intended. I'll see you there. See you later.